A grave in Kent holds a woman buried with weapons. A cemetery in Sussex shows two communities sharing the same ground but never mixing their dead. A family tree near Dover stretches back 4 generations, and somewhere inside it is the exact moment a migrant and a local fell in love. None of this comes from a chronicle. None of it comes from a monk with a quill. It comes from bone. For over 1,000 years, the story of England's birth was told by the winners, and it went something like this. The Romans left, and then the Anglo-Saxons came, and they did not just settle the land, they replaced the people on it. Britons pushed out, Britons wiped out. A clean genetic break between one Briton and the next. That story survived Bede, survived the Victorians, survived 100 years of textbooks. Then scientists opened the graves themselves, and what they found did not match the story at all. This is not fringe archaeology. The research anchoring this video comes from a team led by Josh Gretzinger, working with Professor Duncan Sayer of the University of Central Lancashire and senior author Stefan Schiffels at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, published in the journal Nature in September 2022. The paper sequenced the genomes of 278 individuals buried in early medieval England, set against more than 4,000 ancient genomes and over 10,000 present-day European samples. It is, to date, the largest ancient DNA study of the Anglo-Saxon period ever conducted. This is not a blog theory. It is a peer-reviewed data set drawn straight from the dirt of the graves people are arguing about. Before the DNA, though, you need to understand what these scientists are actually reading. Every one of us carries a kind of genetic paper trail, passed down half from each parent, all the way back through every generation before them. Ancient DNA researchers extract fragments of that trail from centuries-old bone and teeth, usually from a dense part of the skull called the petrous bone, where DNA survives best. Then they compare those fragments against thousands of other genomes, ancient and modern, looking for shared patterns. Think of it like matching fingerprints left on a doorframe. You cannot see the person who touched it, but you can compare the print against a database and know exactly who was standing there and roughly when. That is what Gretzinger's team did, at a scale nobody had managed before. 278 individual doorframes checked against a continent's worth of prints. The picture that emerged was not simple, and it was not the old story either. Genetically, the researchers found that migration into eastern and southern England after Roman rule ended was real, and it was substantial. In parts of what is now East Anglia and southern England, close to 75% of the population carried ancestry connected to communities from the North Sea coast of continental Europe, the regions we associate with the historical Angles, Saxons, and related groups. 75%. Not a boatload of raiders passing through. Out of every 4 people living on an Eastern English farm around the 6th century likely carried that continental ancestry in their blood. Some individual sites went even further than the regional average. Joshua Gretzinger himself said it plainly. Some Anglo-Saxon sites look almost 100% continental European. The only explanation is a large amount of people coming in from the North Sea zone. That is not a sentence a cautious geneticist uses lightly, and it is the clearest signal in the entire data set that this migration was not a myth exaggerated by a medieval monk. If anything, in certain places, Bede may have undersold it. Here's the part that reshapes everything the old story assumed, though. That number does not mean the local British population vanished. It means, in those regions, migrant and local ancestry sat side by side, sometimes in the same household, and crucially, that 75% figure was not uniform across the country. Travel west, into places like the edges of Wessex or further toward Britain's Celtic-speaking regions, and that continental signal drops off fast. This was never one single wave crashing over one uniform island. It was patchy, regional, and it moved at different speeds in different places, which sounds like a small correction until you realize it dismantles the entire total replacement narrative in one move. Now, here's the part that connects the genetics to something you can actually picture. At a cemetery called Appledown in Sussex, studied by Dr. Ceridwen Edwards, who runs the ancient DNA facility at the University of Huddersfield, researchers found something remarkable. Nearly half of the people buried there carried continental ancestry, but the graves themselves told a second story layered on top of the DNA. People with local British ancestry and people with continental ancestry were, in many cases, buried in visibly different styles, in different parts of the same cemetery. Same community, same patch of earth. 2 populations, living and dying side by side for generations, while still marking their dead in ways that kept some kind of distinction alive. That is not a story of replacement. That is a story of 2 peoples, slowly, unevenly, sometimes reluctantly becoming one. There is another site worth putting right next to Appledown because it shows the opposite pattern just as clearly. At Oakington in Cambridgeshire, archaeologists excavated a grave containing an adult male buried with a knife. His ancestry came back at 99.99% continental North European. A few meters away, in the same cemetery, 3 women were buried together in a single triple grave. Genetically, they were not related to each other at all, and each carried a different mix of local British and continental ancestry. Nearby, a young woman in her 20s was laid to rest beneath a prominent mound, dressed in silver jewelry and amber beads, buried with a full-grown cow. Her ancestry turned out to be mostly local British, not continental. Status, in other words, was not handed out based on which ancestry you carried. A locally descended woman could be buried like an aristocrat. A newly arrived man could be buried with almost nothing but a knife. Duncan Sayer, the archaeologist who led that side of the excavation, put it bluntly. We're a million miles away from an invasion hypothesis. It's not a bunch of blokes getting in boats with weapons and conquering territory. The data backs him up in an unexpected place, too. Across the wider study, men buried with weapons turned out to have local and continental ancestry in almost equal measure. If this had been a straightforward armed takeover, you would expect the weapon graves to skew heavily continental. They did not. And then there is Buckland, a cemetery near Dover, where the genetic data let researchers do something that sounds almost impossible. They reconstructed a family tree spanning at least 4 generations, entirely from ancient DNA. Inside that family tree sits the actual generation where a person of migrant ancestry and a person of local ancestry had children together. Not a folk memory of blending, not an assumption. A traceable point inside one family where 2 ancestries became one lineage. If you want a single image to hold on to from this entire story, hold on to that. A family tree dug out of the ground, with the moment of unification still visible inside it. There's also a question worth sitting with here, and it's about who got remembered richly and who didn't. Across the wider data set, women identified as having continental ancestry were more likely to be buried with grave goods than local women were, particularly brooches and strings of beads, the kind of objects that survive well and catch an archaeologist's eye centuries later. That does not mean continental women were universally wealthier. It means the material culture people chose to bury their dead and often tracked cultural identity as much as it tracked actual status or actual ancestry. And those 2 things did not always move together. Put simply, what a grave looks like on the surface and what the DNA says underneath it are not always telling the same story, which is exactly why this research needed both archaeologists and geneticists working side by side, rather than either group working alone. Let's pause and pull this together, because a lot has landed fast. Migration into post. Roman Britain was real, and in the east and south it was large, reaching roughly 75% of the local population's ancestry in places. It was not a total wipeout of the people already there. It played out unevenly across regions, and inside individual communities, it left visible signs of both mixing, as at Buckland, and lingering separation, as at Appledown. What sounded like a single dramatic invasion is starting to look more like a slow, layered, deeply local process. But we have only covered where the ancestry came from. We have not yet covered how much of it is actually still inside you, right now, if you are English. That number might be the most surprising part of this whole story. If you're finding this as strange to sit with as I did researching it, that's usually the sign a video is worth staying on for the next few minutes, so go ahead and hit subscribe now before we get into where this ancestry ended up today. Here is where the story takes its sharpest turn. You would expect, given a 75% migrant ancestry figure in parts of early medieval England, that modern English people would be overwhelmingly descended from those Anglo-Saxon migrants. They are not. According to the same 2022 study, present-day English populations derive, on average, only around 40% of their ancestry from those historic North Sea continental migrants. 40%, not 75. Something diluted that signal considerably in the 1500 years since. Part of the explanation is straightforward. Time. Populations mix, remix, and get overwritten by later arrivals. Generation after generation, and early medieval snapshots do not simply freeze in place. But the more surprising piece of the puzzle is where a big chunk of the rest of modern English ancestry actually comes from. The study found that somewhere between 20 and 40% of present-day English genetic ancestry traces back to populations connected to Iron Age France and Belgium, a signal that shows up not just in modern people, but in the archaeological graves themselves, particularly in Kent, where Frankish-style grave goods turn up alongside this genetic evidence. Stefan Schiffels, the study's senior author, was careful about what this does and does not prove. He noted that it remains unclear whether this additional French and Belgian-linked ancestry arrived through a few concentrated events, something like the Norman conquest centuries later, or whether it built up slowly through continuous cross-channel contact and movement over hundreds of years. In other words, England's genetic story does not end with the Anglo-Saxons at all. It has at least one more major continental contributor layered on top, and the science is not yet finished untangling exactly when that layer was added. So picture England's population not as a single river that flowed in from one direction and settled into a lake. Picture it more like a river delta, fed by multiple separate streams entering at different points in different centuries, each one bringing its own sediment, all of it eventually mixing into the same wide, slow-moving body of water you'd recognize today. The Anglo-Saxon migration was one major stream. It was significant, and in places it dominated the local landscape for a while. But a French and Belgian-linked stream fed into that same delta too, at a scale researchers are still working to date precisely. And neither stream ever fully erased what was already flowing through that channel before either of them arrived. This is also where it's worth being precise about what Anglo-Saxon even means. Because the old narrative used that word to describe a people, almost a single tribe with a single origin point, arriving and conquering as one force. The genetics tell a messier, more interesting story. The researchers found subtle but real genetic differences between the various communities living around the North Sea coast in this period. Communities that history books have often lumped together under one Germanic label. Some of those groups were more closely related to populations in what is now Denmark. Others align more closely with communities from the Netherlands and northern Germany. Anglo-Saxon was never one bloodline moving as a single wave. It was several related but distinct populations, arriving over different time frames, settling into different regions, and gradually forming something new once they got here. Now let's get into how this connects to what people actually believed for centuries, because the contrast matters. Older genetic studies, working only from modern DNA samples without any ancient comparison, had already started chipping away at the total replacement idea well before Gretzinger's 2022 paper. Earlier research, including work associated with the landmark People of the British Isles project, estimated that only around 10 to 40% of modern English DNA, depending on the region studied, traced back to Anglo-Saxon associated ancestry. That was already a significant departure from the old invasion narrative. But those studies had a built-in limitation. They were reading backward from modern populations and trying to guess what happened over 1,000 years ago, hoping the genetic signal had survived largely intact. It's a bit like trying to reconstruct a house fire by only examining the ashes decades later, rather than having footage of the fire itself. The 2022 study changed that completely, because for the first time, researchers had direct genetic footage from the period in question. 278 individuals who were actually alive, buried, and part of these communities while the migration was happening. That is the difference between an educated guess and an eyewitness account written in bone. For roughly the last 30 years before this study, many archaeologists had actually swung toward the opposite extreme, favoring a small elite model, the idea that a relatively modest warrior class arrived, seized power, and imposed their language and culture on a much larger local pop. That model explained why Old English replaced the local British language so thoroughly. What it struggled to explain was a population that, in places, looked almost entirely continental in origin. The 2022 study did not just correct the old total replacement myth, it also corrected the more recent small elite theory that had replaced it, landing somewhere more complicated than either extreme. Real, large-scale migration, but migration that unfolded regionally, unevenly, and alongside a local population that never disappeared. Here's the part that connects everything back to how ordinary people actually lived through this, because underneath every one of these percentages is a set of real individual decisions. Somewhere in early medieval Kent, a family decided to bury their dead the traditional continental way, generation after generation, even while living beside neighbors who buried theirs, differently. Somewhere near Dover, a person with local ancestry and a person with migrant ancestry chose each other, had children, and those children's descendants are sitting inside that reconstructed four-generation family tree today, whether they know it or not. This was never an abstract population-level event happening to nobody in particular. It was thousands of individual, human, sometimes cautious and sometimes wholehearted decisions about who to marry, where to settle, and how to bury the people they loved. The genetics just happened to be the only record detailed enough to let us see those decisions 1,500 years later. It's worth sitting with just how much this reframes the phrase Anglo-Saxon England itself. For centuries, that phrase implied a fairly tidy story. Outsiders arrive, locals disappear, a new nation forms in their place. The genetic record instead describes something closer to two overlapping, unevenly blended populations, slowly forging a shared identity over multiple centuries, with a third continental contribution folded in afterward, and regional variation baked in from the very start. England, genetically speaking, was never formed. It was assembled, slowly, messily, region by region, family by family. Now, with all of that said, it's worth being honest about where this evidence is strong and where it still has real limits, because that distinction matters. This is population-level science. It is extraordinarily good at telling us what proportion of ancestry existed across a cemetery, a region, or country at a given moment in time. What it generally cannot do is take a single-named historical figure, someone like a specific Anglo-Saxon king mentioned in a chronicle, and directly confirm their personal ancestry, unless that individual's actual remains have been identified, recovered, and sequenced, which is rare. Nobody is claiming this study proves the ancestry of any particular named ruler from Bede's writing. What it proves is the shape of the population those rulers were governing and the shape of the families living around them. To be clear, that is still an enormous scientific achievement. But it is a population-scale picture, not a biography of any one individual, and the two should never be confused. It's also worth noting that questions genuinely remain unresolved, including exactly when and how that later French and Belgian-linked ancestry entered the population, something Schiffels himself flagged as unfinished business for future research rather than a settled conclusion. There is also a limit worth naming honestly about how migration itself happened on the ground. The genetic data can show us that continental ancestry arrived and spread. It cannot, on its own, tell us the emotional texture of that arrival, whether a given family crossed the North Sea as refugees, fleeing collapsing settlements back home, as invited settlers, or as something else entirely. Duncan Sayer has pointed to archaeological evidence in northern Germany of entire settlements ending abruptly around the 5th or 6th century, which fits a picture of families and small communities relocating together rather than lone raiders. But intention, ear, opportunity, none of that survives in a genome. Only the outcome does, which brings this all the way back to that grave in Kent, that cemetery in Sussex, and that family tree near Dover. None of them are footnotes anymore. They are the actual primary evidence for how modern England came to exist, more reliable in some ways than the written chronicles that shaped the story for over 1,000 years. The Anglo-Saxons did come, in real and substantial numbers, and in the east and south of the country they reshaped the local population profoundly. But they did not erase what was there before them, and they were not even the last major group to leave a lasting genetic mark on the island. England was not conquered into existence by one people replacing another. It was built, layer by layer, migration by migration, marriage by marriage, out of population after population, who chose, or were forced, or simply happened, to share the same small island and eventually the same descendants. So the next time you hear someone describe the Anglo-Saxons as the people who simply took over Britain and erased everyone who was already there, you'll know the graves themselves tell a more complicated, more human story. Tell me in the comments which surprised you more, that 75% migrant ancestry figure in early medieval Eastern England, or the fact that modern English ancestry is closer to 40% Anglo-Saxon with a whole second continental population folded in behind it.